Another thing is, in my 150 vassals, you don't fight anybody else in my alliance. In other words, you just don't do that. And when I go to war, you bring your army and join me. And you fight alongside me. You know, there's a very interesting prophecy that Jeremiah gives. And the prophecy goes something like this. That there will come a time when the kings of the nations will set up their thrones outside the gate of Jerusalem. Now, if you know history, it was the Babylonians that conquered Jerusalem. It was Nebuchadnezzar. But you see, Nebuchadnezzar was a suzerain. And when he attacked Jerusalem, he would have had all of his vassals as part of his army. And they would have been there, the kings would have been with their troops. And they would have set up there, just like he prophesied, outside the city of Jerusalem. And so I want you to notice that these were the kind of stipulations in the covenants. And next time you pass through London, as I'm sure you will, maybe in the next year or two, stop off and go to the British Museum, and you will find many more examples of this kind of covenant, because it was so well known, and many have been found in archaeology. Another example is if there's rumours against a suzerain among the vassal cities, they have to suppress them. In other words, the vassals have to protect the suzerain. If there's plots against the suzerain, they have to expose them. But then there's even things to do with law and order. If someone murders someone in one vassal city and runs to another vassal city, there has to be an extradition treaty. They have to be given up so they could be tried. And we could go on with the details. There's many details, including succession. Part of the agreement would be, the suzerain is saying, if or when I die, you, the vassal, are agreeing to continue to serve my successor. And when you die, your successor is bound by this same treaty. You know, we can sometimes think that people a long time ago were kind of idiots. But I tell you, they were very intelligent. And all of these things were very carefully worked out. And this is what we know as a suzerain treaty. But there were some benefits too for the vassal. Not many, but there were some benefits. The suzerain would say to the vassal that he had conquered, if you are faithful to the covenant, I will make sure your throne is protected. And if anybody attacks you, I will come and protect you. And if there's a famine and you're about to all starve to death, I'll make sure you have food. And so there were these kind of elements as well. And the reason the suzerain would do that, of course, is he wanted a strong empire. It's not going to help him if his vassals are attacked. And so you get this understanding. Now, as people have actually read and studied this particular form of covenant, they have found that each one has its own structure. This was common to the Hittite treaties of the second millennium, all the way through to the first millennium, including the Assyrian period, which was around the time of Isaiah. They all had a very similar structure. And the scholars who've studied these structures, these are the titles that have been given. It begins with what they like to call the Preamble. And the Preamble is simply identifying who the suzerain is. I, king of Hatzor, the great Huttitati, who is mighty and honoured by the gods and considered awesome and wonderful and over the world, and I control animals and do wonderful things and I'm awesome. See, that's how it begins. It identifies who the the suzerain is. And then there's what the scholars call a historical prologue. And what this is a piece of the covenant which actually reflects on the events that have led up to the making of the covenant. And often it would talk about how amazingly merciful the suzerain was, and the very fact that the vassal is still alive, and on and on. But I just want to say this too. Sometimes, if there's a king of a small kingdom, and there's larger kingdoms around, that king would know he is vulnerable. And there were times when a small king would voluntarily become a vassal of a powerful king simply for the protection. Now, you're going to see this in Kings and in Isaiah when you come to King Ahaz, king of Judah, because that's exactly what he did. And it was actually completely destructive, awful, but that's what he did. And so you get the historical prologue, and then you get the actual stipulations of the covenant, and then you get a feature which is consistent with all of these covenants, and they're known as the blessings and the curses. Because at the end of the covenant, the suzerain says things like, if you obey the covenant, in other words, you keep it, you will be blessed, and all these gods will bless you, and I will bless you, and I will do these nice things for you. But if you disobey the covenant, if you break the covenant stipulations, then you will be cursed, and I will personally make sure you're cursed. And there will be a long list of all of the consequences of breaking the covenant. I will take you, and I will do this to you, and I will do that to you, and I will, and it's all listed out, and it is listed out in great detail. At the King's Lodge, I didn't bring it with me, but I have a booklet which is the translation of one of the covenants, and you can literally read everything, all of the details. And it really is very detailed. And then finally, I've mentioned this, the scholars like to call it covenant continuity, and it's simply saying that there's going to come a time when the covenant, if I die the suzerain, then you are bound by this covenant with my son, my successor. If you die, your son is bound by this covenant. In other words, it's making provision for the covenant to go beyond one generation. And they all have this too. And so that is something that is a feature of this third covenant that is known as a suzerainty covenant. It's a one-sided covenant. It isn't something negotiated. It's accepted or it's rejected. Now, I want you just to go back to Exodus 19, because there's in Exodus 19, this is when God at Mount Sinai enters into a covenant relationship with Israel. And as God was about to set up this nation, we have this group of rather wealthy refugees. They have no land, they have no system of government whatsoever, they have no army, they have no justice system, they have nothing. They've just come to the Mount Sinai. God is now, as I've mentioned, and I'm sure others as well, they're going to receive the instruments of nationhood, and the question is, what kind of government system would God give Israel? We all know that the parliamentary democracy like we have in England, the mother of all parliaments, is the best in the world, isn't it?
Watch it.
Yes. There's different systems, isn't there? What kind would God use for Israel? Well, so often we see God take something that Israel would have understood and related to. He didn't end up giving them aeroplanes or laptops, He gave them something that was part of their world, part of what they understood, part of what they related to, and he cleaned it up and dusted it off and sanctified it, but he used something that they would have understood. And what God was doing in Exodus, he was entering into a covenant with Israel, and it was after this model. Because he was the suzerain. He was the king. There's no negotiation. Notice what it says here in Exodus. He says, Exodus 19:4, "You've seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." Beautiful picture of God's deliverance. "Now therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant." It's not our covenant. It's my covenant. "If you keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession." And then he ends up, then he continues, should I say, to give them the stipulations of the covenant. And that is how they should live, how they should relate to him, how they should relate to one another, how they should relate as a nation. And then there was the invitation, are you going to obey my covenant? And the elders, the 70 elders representing the nation, said, we will obey. And there was a covenant meal that they had in the presence of God to ratify the covenant. They formally entered into a covenant after this particular kind. And when you read Exodus, and you have what is known as a book of the covenant, 21, 22, 23, 24, then you have the tabernacle and all of that, and you have Leviticus. You come to the end of Leviticus, and we didn't talk about it, but you get that whole chapter, and that chapter is on the blessings and the curses. I don't know if you notice that. It's chapter 26. And the first verses are about the blessings. And then from 26:14 onwards, but if you do not obey me, you get a list of the curses. Because you see, the covenant he entered into with the people was after this particular kind. Now the difference, of course, between a human suzerain who is out for his own benefit, own power, own wealth, the difference is that God is the most amazing suzerain of love and kindness and wisdom and mercy, and every stipulation of his covenant was for the benefit of the people, when the stipulations of the human suzerain are for the benefit of the suzerain. And so it's not quite the same from that perspective, but I want you to see it was this particular structure. And we know that because when we come to Deuteronomy, what we actually find is that there's two structures I've mentioned. I've mentioned the sermon structure, and we'll look at that again, but we also have Deuteronomy, and it is structured after the Hittite suzerainty treaty. And you'll see this because it begins with the preamble, and that identifies those who are speaking. It identifies Moses as the speaker, but as we read in verse 3, Moses is speaking just as the Lord had commanded him. And so these are the words of God to Israel in that little bit of the preamble. And then you get the historical prologue. And what you get is a recounting of the particular experience of Israel from the time they refused to enter the land in Numbers 14 all the way up until that present time. And it's talking about their failure, but also the victories. And then in chapter 4 it goes back to Sinai and what happened at Sinai and God's presence at Sinai. And so you get what is known as the historical prologue. And then you get what is known as the covenant stipulations. Now, typically in the archaeological artifacts they found after this nature, the covenant stipulations are in two parts. The first part are general principles. In other words, the suzerain is saying, you need to obey what I tell you, and the reason you need to obey is because how great I am, and all reasons underlying the call to obey the covenant, and then you will get into the specific stipulations. And what is interesting in Deuteronomy is it follows the same pattern. You have not yet read, is it 5 through 20? What was it you haven't read yet? 12 to 26. Okay, so you've read the general principles. What you'll read tomorrow are the specific stipulations, and you'll notice that's what they are. It's quite detailed of what God is requiring. And what it is it's following this particular pattern. It begins, of course, with a restating of the Ten Commandments, general principles, and they're elaborated on a bit, and then you get the specific details. And then in Deuteronomy 27, 28, 29, and into 30, you have the blessings and the curses. And particularly, you've read 28, haven't you? And did you notice that chapter? It starts off great and it gets really depressing. Because it just goes on and on and on about what's going to happen to them if they do not obey the covenant. And what you'll notice is that there is a progression. It starts off with things like famine and drought and mildew and locusts and these kind of events. But then it goes on to say you will not be able to withstand your enemies, and they will conquer you. And when you come to Judges and following, that's exactly what you see. Because you see, when Israel disobeyed, God, as it were, lifted his hand of protection off of them. And when that happened, the surrounding nations were free to come in and really do what they wanted. Imagine living in a village somewhere and you actually didn't know whether the Philistines would come with their soldiers and basically take everything you have. Take your children because they want slaves, and you are really pretty powerless. Very terrifying way to live. But God says, if you disobey me, that is the kind of thing you can expect. And that is God simply lifting his hand of protection off. But if you obey me, you will be strong. And it goes all the way down, the curses go all the way down to eventually you will lose the land. You will be taken into exile. And everything will be destroyed. And that is why when you come to the prophets and the prophets are doing their thing, they're not actually saying anything new. They're simply restating this. Only they're doing it in a way that is contemporary to the people at the time. And then finally, covenant continuity, you get Joshua commissioned. He's going to take over. You get in chapter 22 the Song of Moses, this remarkable song that he taught people, which was there so that they could remember. He stipulates in this portion that the law should be read every 7 years publicly to everybody, so they're being reminded of their responsibilities. You get the blessings to the next generation, and then of course you get the death of Moses. And so just to say, this is what is going on behind Deuteronomy. It is this kind of covenant, this kind of structure. When you read, you will find that Israel, when they were faithful during the time of David and Solomon, they were the suzerain. They were the ones that were the head and not the tail. But as soon as they walked away from God, then they lost that. And very often they were vassals. And then they would rebel. And then the suzerain would come with their armies and surround Jerusalem and conquer them again. And it's this kind of thing that is happening that you will discover. Okay, we're going to stop now and have a break now. But before we do that, any questions on any of this? I know it's all been technical, but hopefully it will be useful. Yes?
Just a note, during your speech there, we're teaching DreamWorks Hall, and they're wondering if you're available for that. Steven Spielberg.
Thank you. Well, I was going to actually lead a graphic artist school, and you can all sign up if you want. Yeah. Hallelujah. All right. With that note of blessing on me, we're going to stop and have a break.
15 minutes. that they would probably carry No. I'm not sure. Okay. All right, let's get started. And then Austin. Where's Austin? Just left. Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. Bill.
Just make sure your coffee cups are full so that we can... And so, as we come to this book of Deuteronomy, we can see how carefully it has been put together. It's not random. It's been deliberately structured because it is actually representing what it is. It's representing the whole understanding of a covenant. And the big call, and the thing that you find over and over again in the early part, is a call to covenant faithfulness. And that is this understanding that I said there's like 3 sermons of Moses. Now, for most of church history, the understanding of the suzerainty treaty was not actually known. That wasn't known until these artifacts were discovered in archaeology.
Wow.
And so that would have been like 150, 200 years ago. Before then, people would read Deuteronomy and this is what they would see. And this, of course, is true. But then as archaeology, this whole discipline became part of our existence, and people began to dig and find all sorts of things. So people discovered all amazing things. You know, one of the reasons biblical studies is such a dynamic discipline is because it is so alive. People are finding things all the time that's bringing more understanding. Now, of course, you don't need any of that to read the Bible and know we need to be saved. You know? We don't need any of that to know the message of the Bible, that we're sinners and God loved us and sent His Son to die, and as we have faith in Him, so we can have new life. But as we are able to go discover these things, so meaning comes, understanding comes in whole new areas. And it's actually really very exciting. And so we have these sermons of Moses, as people have identified, and this is why there's such a lot of passion. You know, about 50 times Moses uses the word hear or listen. And I can just imagine him. I don't know how he gave this particular, whether he stood on a rock and there was Israel in front of him, or how it happened, whether it was written and then read to people. But you can just you just feel the passion when he keeps saying, listen, listen. He had lived with these people all these years and he knew their hearts. And as he was about to die, he knew what would happen if they didn't obey the covenant. And there was such an urgency in his heart. 177 times are words like do or keep the covenant, or obey. That is the passion that you see over and over again. And I just love this phrase, remember and do not forget. It's as if, you know, parents, sometimes they want to get the attention of their children. I don't know if you other parents have done this, but you kind of get down to the kids' level and you get hold of their face and you look them straight in the eye and you say, now listen to me. Do I have your attention? You know, and then you say what you're going to say because you want them to get it. And it's almost like this is what is going on here with Moses. Now, I've just been reflecting on the best way to serve you guys with what we have next in the time we have left. There's different ways. There's different ways. Let me go to this other presentation. You remember the other day we looked at this particular model of application. We went through all this. This particular model I suggested as a way of reflecting on the different commands and how everything really is a statement of loving God and loving your neighbour. And what I want to suggest to you is that one of the things we have going on in this early part of Scripture with the laws of Moses is that we're being presented with what is been known as a paradigm. If that's a new word to you, what it means is simply it's a model that can be applied in various situations. So there's a single set of principles, but they can be applied in different ways. And so Israel is a paradigm. In one single culture, that's Israel's ancient culture, in one slice of history, that is the particular time of Israel, what we see demonstrated are the kinds of social values that God looks for in human life generally. Now I can illustrate this with the Ten Commandments. You know, the Ten Commandments are something that we don't talk about much today. There was one time in the Christian world where every child was able to recite them. How many people could recite the Ten Commandments? 1, 2, 3. See, one of the problems is it has the word command in, and we don't like that. We don't like being told what to do. But what happens, and you see this in Exodus, you see this in Deuteronomy chapter 5, that it starts with these words when God says, I am the God. Let me read it. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of slavery. And the reason God gave Israel the Ten Commandments was because He wanted them to stay free. He wanted them to stay out of slavery. And when you read them, you find the very first thing He says is that you shall have no other gods before me. Now the reason this is important is because the kind of, I've mentioned this I think already, the kind of gods a nation worships determine the kind of nation that will be. It is really basic because the kind of God we worship determines their worldview and determines their sense of values. And I can't remember if I said to you or not because I can't remember. But the statement and the Declaration of Independence that says it is, what are the words? It is self-evident that God has made all men equal. Did we talk about this? Yeah. But it's not. And so it's really important that our worldview. And then you go through how it says, do not make for yourself any idol. Because that restricts God. Because whatever idol we make will diminish Him. Because nothing can reflect God apart from, as I said, Jesus. And then you don't take His name in vain. Talking there about a society that keeps their word. We looked at this, didn't we, in Leviticus 19. And then the Sabbath day and the value of the Sabbath. A society where people can rest, can celebrate, can enjoy time. A society where there's strong family, where human life has value. Do not murder is a statement of the value of human life. And I really believe the value of human life comes from the gospel, comes from the Bible. Why is it right now that there's this people trafficking thing going on? You've probably read about it, that people want to escape Syria, North Africa, and they're these people traffickers. They take their money, they put them in these leaky boats, they bring them across to the Mediterranean, and they leave them just off the coast of Christian Europe, even though we're not that Christian. And what happens when they leave them? People are immediately out trying to rescue people. The traffickers just walk away, drive away, leave them to sink. Whether they make it or not doesn't matter to them. But it's this continent that has Christian roots that is out trying to protect them and bring them into safety. You know, there's other parts of the Mediterranean they could leave them, but they don't want to go there. It's because of the value of human life, and it comes out of these here. You shall not murder. We talked about the destructive nature of sexual immorality. You shall not steal. It makes a statement that God in his economy believes in private ownership. You can't steal something if you don't own it, if someone doesn't own it. And what is fascinating is that when things are in common, they're not cared for or looked after. Or I tell you, as YWAMers on a YWAM base, we know that. If you have a car, when I used to fix cars, this is interesting. When I fixed cars in the garage, we'd have customers that would maybe had a company car in their own car. And when they brought the company car in for servicing, we knew it wasn't looked after. It would be dirty and messy and all what have you. They would bring in their own personal car and it was really looked after. We could see the difference. And when property is kind of common, people don't tend to look after it as much, and we just struggle with that in our different communities. The stuff that is for everybody's use can get trashed so easily. And so you see these sort of values. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbour. What God wanted in society is law courts where justice is done. Really important. You've read Lauren's book probably, or heard him speak, and he talks about the Trinity of Evil that will keep a country poor. And that Trinity is injustice, corruption, and unbridled greed. And you look around the world at nations that are locked into poverty, and that is what you see. It is really difficult to get justice done in the law court system. It's fine if you've got money. Otherwise it's really difficult. And so we see these things in this amazing gift that God has given in the Ten Commandments that has been the foundation of so much of our Western world. And so basically the idea of a paradigm is that we see in these laws, even though they were related to an ancient people 3,500 years ago, nonetheless there's principles that apply today. And so this is a quote from an Old Testament scholar that I have appreciated so much reading his work, his different books. This one here, the one I read, was Old Testament Ethics for the People of God. And if this interests you, I commend this to you. Israel as a society was intended from the start to be a paradigm or model to the nations. A showcase of the way God longs for human society as a whole to operate. And you just see that. We've mentioned already that this is not God's highest because it's for fallen people. But you see in it a justice. Let's just give you an example. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 1. as soon as you get through the prologue, and you begin to get into the book, you get into this historical portion. And the thing that is interesting to me that Moses mentions is the time in Exodus 18 when he took advice from his father-in-law. Jethro said to him, you're carrying too much of a weight, you need to share the load. And so he did, but I want you to notice how he places it. How he speaks about it. In Deuteronomy chapter 1 verse 12, how can I bear the heavy burden of all your disputes all by myself? And then this is what he says, choose for each of your tribes individuals who are wise, discerning, and reputable to be your leaders. Now, you have to excuse me if that isn't really the foundation of democracy. Because that's what we do, well, theoretically, that's what we should be doing. Sometimes it's hard to find people that are like this. But you notice that right at the beginning here, when it comes to this nation, even though the overarching structure is God's, the suzerain, when it comes down to how things should work, it is based on people choosing choosing their own leaders. People who they consider are wise and discerning and reputable, people of character. You choose those people to be your leaders. They're not appointed, you choose them. So you see this sort of value. And then verse 16, and I charged your judges at that time, give the members of your community a fair hearing, and judge rightly between one person and another, whether citizen or resident alien. You must not be partial in judgment. Hear out the small and the great alike, the poor or the wealthy, those with no influence or a lot of influence. You shall not be intimidated by anyone, for the judgment is God's. We've only got 17 verses into this book, and two things have been emphasized. One, good leadership. You choose that. And secondly, the law court system of your nation must be rigorously just. You do not favour the wealthy. You do not favour the poor. You do not favour any of these, because the judgment is the Lord's. And then, any case too hard for you, bring to me, and I will hear it. A court of appeal. A place to go when things are really difficult. And you see these, and these are the elements that make a strong nation. Simple things like this. And so we see Israel as a paradigm. Now, just different ways that we can read Deuteronomy. It can be interpreted, of course, in the light of the individual Christian. And this is the normal way that Christians read Deuteronomy. We read it and we say, God, what is it you're saying to me? Or what is it that applies to me? And we'll look at that in a few moments. Another way is, how can we read this in the light of the church? What does it say to us as the body of Christ? We too maybe should be looking for leaders who are people of integrity. We too want our churches to be able to model care for the poor and the needy, to support those who are in need. And there's many things we could get from that. The other way is to read the text in the light of the wider society. And friends, if we as a mission are called to disciple nations, how are we going to do that? What are we actually going to say? If we're to influence the sphere of family, where do we get our understanding of that? If we're going to speak into business, economics, how do we do that? What about government? You see, what we have in these books, as well as the prophets that add so much, as well as wisdom literature that adds so much, we have much we can say into society, into the spheres of society, when we understand the nature of the literature we have in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Proverbs, Amos, Jeremiah, and so on and so forth. Because God is speaking into society. There was a YWAM ministry I was reading about. Maybe some of you know of this. I don't know whether it's continuing or not. I certainly hope it is. But I was reading about this in Zambia. Anybody know about YWAM in Zambia? Apparently, one of the great tragedies is in Zambia would be if a man, let's imagine a family, has a house, a plot of land, a husband, wife, children. If the man was to die young, what would happen is, according to law, that piece of land actually belonged to the widow. But what would happen is the family of the dead man would come in and take that land and evict the widow and her children, and she would be homeless and landless. And this was happening and causing tremendous hardship, because for many of these women with nothing, the only option open was prostitution that they could see. And what this ministry is or was doing is the YWAMers who were able to know the law were able to come alongside those widows, support them, walk them through the court process so they could regain the land that they would have. What a fantastic ministry. Isn't that exactly what it says in Deuteronomy about caring for the widow and the orphan and protecting them? Isn't that a way of expressing the heart of God for them? You see, as we understand these books that can be so neglected by the church because we're not quite sure how to read them, and when we do they're boring, because we're reading them trying to find some little personal truth and it doesn't work, what we're missing out on is something so significant in their calling to be influencing the nations. I will give you this PowerPoint. There's some websites here of different ministries that are doing such excellent work in this whole area. And if this is at all of interest to you, I commend them to you, and you can explore them and see what they have to say. There was this, I'll just tell you this story. There was this man by the name of Michael Schluter. Michael was working in the World Bank. You can look at that if you're bored listening to me. He was in Kenya working with the World Bank, and there was the pastor of the International Church. He was Roy Clements. These people were friends. And it was a time when East Africa was in quite a lot of turmoil because of political change. Kenya was finding its independence from the United Kingdom and moving into democracy. And